So in this video, we're going to look at player objects, essentially. So objects are things you can interact with in your game. Now, there are like hundreds of different types of objects you can have. So an object is not necessarily just your player. It could be a clickable menu button. It could be a music. It could be something that controls what happens in the level. An object is basically just something that interacts with the game or makes it interactable, essentially. But what we're going to look at is a player object, essentially. So if you right click on objects, click on create, and then we'll click on object. We can call this obj for object underscore player. So we know this is the player object. Now, as default, nothing will be there. It'll be completely empty. So what we can do is add a sprite, and I'm going to add a sprite that I did in my previous sprite video of just this little sort of winking guy that I made. Really quick, really easy. So what I can do, so again, I also did this in my rooms video, so I've already created a room prior to this with a few different things in. What I might actually do is get rid of some of these tiles because we don't need all of them. In fact, we'll get rid of them all because we don't need all of them in here. In fact, I'll put one or two in just so we can sort of see that there's different tiles available. Put some piping in as well, maybe. And maybe a few of these as well. So there we go. So we've got some space to work with, but we've also got some things within the room. So now, what we can do with the OBJ player is drag him in. Now, what it'll say is, if you look on here, it says X. Now, the reason it says X is because objects can't be placed within the tile layer, but they can be placed within instances. So, what I would suggest is, you rename this instances layer, and we'll call it player. We'll call it player layer, because we know that they're on that layer then. And we can drag them in. Now, as you can see, he's quite big because we made him 64 by 64, so that's why he's quite large compared to like the 16 by 16 ones that we'd made previously. Now what we can do is drag him in, and then we can actually shrink him if we really want to. Now we can shrink him, and then he will automatically snap to these little bits, which probably will be a little bit better. But again, if we go up here and turn off snap, we can actually place him just absolutely anywhere without it snapping. So now we can place him wherever we want. But I'm just going to place him sort of here, say. So we've now got a player that we can sort of work with, hopefully. So if we double click back on as player, so we open back up the workspace for him, we can actually do some things with him. Now, by default, he is just sat here not doing anything at all. So if I press play on this game and show you what it looks like, let's see if it'll actually come on screen. It has. So here he is. So we've got him on screen, and he's obviously animating as well because we told him to animate. So at the minute, he's not really doing a lot. He's just sat there winking, and he's not going to do anything unless we tell him to. So at the minute, there's absolutely no code for him. So what my plan is, I'm going to make a little platformer because that's what we've got. We've got a few platforms in. So I'll make a character that can move left to right, up, down, that sort of thing. So if we go on to create, so it'll ask if you want to make it in GML code or visual. I would always suggest code because code we can do pretty much anything with. Visual, you can pretty much do all those things, but you can't do absolutely everything with it. So if you click on create, it'll say insert description here. So what we can do is we can write it here. We can say, so I suggest we comment code, initialize variables for player. And it will put that in a second. It just needs to update and delete that line as well. So as variables we might need, so there is inbuilt things called like speed. So if it goes green, they're inbuilt variables. So this is the coding thing essentially for each object slash script slash whatever. But for this in particular, it's for our player. So we're going to set some variables. Now you don't necessarily need to put var in. So a lot of things expect you to put var or int or things like that. You don't necessarily need to do that. I'm going to make something called speed, make it equal to 5, say. So we know that that's roughly going to be the speed of what he travels at. Now what will happen is it'll go blue, like it has just done there, and it'll be orange. Now the reason it's orange is because it's not being used. It says it's only been referenced once, if you look. So that's fine. We will use these eventually. Now, what we could do instead of doing it this way, so we might have the variables here. We can also make variables in here as well. And it's the same thing essentially. You wouldn't need it on create. The better thing with having variable definitions here is we can change them without having to look through every bit of code. We can literally just say, oh, this is what the variable is initialized at. We'll use it here. So we can either do it on create or we can do it here. I'm going to suggest that we do it down here on variable definitions. So, or we can do it on both just to sort of show you, but it's the same thing basically. So if we click add, and the variable name we're going to call it SPD for speed, and we said we're going to have it as 5 as default, or we could have it as 0 as default, say. And the type, so type is what type of thing it is an integer string. So this is obviously an integer because it's the speed, and then we can add some more on as well. And we can keep doing this. So let's do jump height. I'll make that default 0. So we'll keep everything as 0. That's not a problem. Jump height. Oops. Let's not do that. We don't want to do that just yet. Let me zoom back in. So add again. We'll have grav. So you've got some gravity that's in there. Oops. I'm doing it by code. Let's keep it at 0. And we'll have that as a integer. So integers... there are floating point numbers as well that's in here, so you can use floating point numbers. I don't know if they refer to them as real. So yeah, it's real numbers for floating point numbers. Now we could have them as real, could have them as integers. Probably better having them as real actually. But yeah, so we're gonna add all these in, but well. We might add all these in later, but just to speed it up, I'm going to just put it in here. So these are some of the variables I'm going to use. I'm going to nick some code that I've got from earlier. So basically, I've made things called speed. So that's speed at which the character will travel. Jump height, how high the character jumps. Oops, we've also got gravity, so gravity, the higher the quicker character will fall. X speed, right, so X speed and Y speed. So X speed is how fast it's traveling in one direction, so it can either be left or right. So how fast the character is traveling in on direction. Oops, we spell direction properly. This is the same, how fast the character is traveling in the Y direction. Probably should put the X direction for this one. Right, so these two I've put on here. You don't necessarily need these. That's just for if you've, say, got to pick up a key and you're wanting to, finish the level or anything like that. We don't actually need those two, so I might get rid of those two. So these I could have initialized in my variable definitions down here instead. So by default it's set at 0, but we're just changing them on create, but that's fine. It just means that we can change them at any point if we really need to. Yeah, we don't need to do it that way necessarily. So if you notice that some of these are actually not oranged out because we didn't define them down here. I've actually spelled jump height differently to what I have in here, so that should be the same pretty much. So that should be jump height like that. But yeah, obviously we'd also have these in here. In fact, we'll add them just quickly. X speed, and we'll also have Y speed. So that's essentially initializing them. This is setting them to a certain thing, essentially. It's always good to have this just in case. But we've got it. So if I was to, so it doesn't, if you notice, it doesn't update. So if I close it and then reopen it, it should be that these two will stop appearing as that, I'm hoping. Although it looks like it's not changing, but I definitely spelled it the same, or I should have done with no spaces, and I have. So they will disappear. It's just been awkward, I think, at the minute. But anyway, so we've initialized variables. Like I say, you can either just do it in here or you can do it in variable definitions. I would suggest you probably do both, just so it can change it if we need to, and it just makes it easier. Right, so now we've got our variables to start. We need to do something as the game is running. Now, on here, so when you add an event, these are all different events. So you can obviously do it for if you press a key, or if you do something in your mouse, or after a certain time, or you can do it on collision with something. So there's quite a lot of different events we can have. So on the create event is when the game first launches, we're going to give them these parameters essentially to work with. So what we're now going to do is make something called step. Now step is when the game is running. So what we can do is say do as the game is running. So we can get it to do things as the game is currently running. Now, we don't necessarily, so we could do this in two different ways. I'm going to show you this first way, or in fact, I'll show you a different way first, and then we'll do step. So keep step blank for now, and we'll do something else first. But I'll show you why it's better to do it in step. So if we add event on key down, on let's say key down left, so when we hit the left key, it's going to move left. So again, we can change that to say on left key press move left. Now to move left, all we need to do, so it's already saying if the key's pressed down, so we don't need to have any code saying if this key's pressed down. It is already being pressed down, we just need to move it in a certain direction. So what we can do is we can be like, right, x speed equals, so speed, so that's obviously how fast we're traveling because we set that, times -1, because that is going either left or right. So if you're going left, it's in the minus direction because we're going that way. If it's right, then we're going that way. So we're setting the speed to a certain direction, we're going that way. So then what we can do after that is we can get it to move. So to get it to move, we have a variable called x. Now this, because it's in green, this is something that the game actually uses. So we're saying where it is on screen, the x value. So we can say x plus equals x speed, like that. So what I'll now do is it will go in the opposite direction. Now plus equals basically just means that it's adding that speed on constantly. So it will add it on and keep going that way. So obviously we set speed as 5. So what it'll do is set as -5, and it'll move it to the -5 on screen. Then it'll move it another -5 on screen, then another -5 on screen every frame, essentially. So if we have a look at that and press play, and then move this onto here, if I press my left key now, there you go, it moves. Obviously I can only get it to do that at the moment, because that's what we're telling it to. We're just telling it to move ever so slightly. So as we press the key down, it moves that way. Now, to make it easier on ourselves, we can duplicate this. So if we duplicate event and have it on key down right instead, so as right button on his keyboard, double click on this. So it will say the same thing. So I could say on right key press, move right. And then instead of having x speed -1, we can just times it by 1 because that's going this way this time. So if we have a look at that, we should now be able to move left and right fairly easily. And let me just put this on screen so you can see. So there you go. So that's left, that's right, and I can move either way, and he's still sort of winking. Now we can change the speed of that quite easily now because of the way we've set it up. So if I go on create, I can turn the speed up quite easily. So I can set it to like 15 and it'll be super fast. That's 15 pixels every frame. So now once I've relaunched it and I put it back on screen, look how fast he goes. So he proper goes really fast now. and also it'll go off screen. Now that carries on, so there are negative X values and a lot more positive Y values than just on screen. So it will go completely off screen and it will keep going forever, unless we tell it not to. But what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to reset this back to 5 because I think that was a little bit too fast. So what we can also have then, so player can move left and right, but obviously if you notice it's not got any gravity. Now that's because we haven't given it any gravity, but we can. So in order to give it gravity, and it's quite easy to be honest, if we add event, and in fact we don't need to add event because we've already got it, we'll do it on step. So step is as the game's running. As the game's running, we want to apply gravity to this object, so this player. And there are inbuilt functions for gravity, but I think it's best if you learn how to actually program gravity in first, because if you understand the concepts of how gravity works, you can then apply that to just using the inbuilt one and then change that as to what you need it. But we'll create it on here for now because it makes more sense to me to do that. So it's very similar to what we've already done before. It's actually quite easy. So what we do is y speed, which is that variable set up earlier, plus equals gravity. So we called it grav. So what that will now do is, as you're in the air, gravity will start pulling it down, essentially, faster and faster and faster, which is what it would do in real life anyway, until you hit a terminal velocity. Now, we could set up a terminal velocity, but for this, we won't at the minute. So that's the y speed, and then the same as before, we do y equals, y plus equals y speed. There we go. So that'll keep adding to this now. So when we run this, he will hopefully just fall off screen. Now, I'm going to have to be quick at putting this on screen. Not quick enough, unfortunately, but he did fall off screen. I will see if I can actually get it to run on this window instead, but likelihood is it's probably not going to do that first off. But what I will do, just to show you that it does work, I might slow this down considerably, just so you can see what it looks like. So let's do 0.01 and just run that. And I'll try and get it up on screen. So there you go, it's slowly falling off. So it does work, that's the whole point. So there is gravity, but I'm going to keep it at 0.07 because that's a bit better for 60 frames, because that's what we're currently running it at. So now he's falling off screen, but you noticed he fell down through the objects, so he fell down through that. That's because these don't have any collision at all yet, and we need to set them up with collision because there isn't any. Now again, I could show you how to do proper collision using the inbuilt collision tool, but what we're going to do is we're going to make his own collision because again, that is probably better that you learn that first. So in order to make collision on things like this, there's numerous ways around it. There is more complicated ways of doing it. You're supposed to use bounding boxes in order to do it, but I'm going to show you a method that one of my colleagues showed me because I think that's probably an easier way of doing it just for this sort of tutorial. So what you need to do is you need to go into sprites, and we need to make a new sprite for the actual collision, because otherwise it won't realize that there is ground there. So I'm going to make a new sprite. I'm going to call it SPR underscore collision. Now this collision, I'm just going to make it really, really simple, just so we know what it is. So I'm going to make it sort of red, so we know that that's a collision tile. Oops. And I'm also going to turn the opacity down ever so slightly. If I remember where the opacity is, I think it's on here, that's it. So I'm going to turn the alpha down to about half, and then use a paint bucket tool to fill that in. So what that will do is that'll cover over things so we can see it, hopefully. So now we've got this thing. By the way, make sure it's as big as your tiles as well, so that if you remember in my previous videos, my tiles for this in particular are 18 by 18. So 18 by 18. And that's fine. We want it like that anyway. So I'm going to leave that in the top left corner because that will help with the snapping. So that will snap to specific blocks, but that's fine. It'll still work. So if we go back onto our room 1 and make a brand new instance layer, so these circles, I'm going to rename this and call it oops, lowercase c, collision layer. Now this is obviously going to be used for your collision. So what we need to now do is open assets back up, and we need to create a new object. So anything that the player can interact with is an object. So we're going to choose the sprite we've just made, which is that red sprite, the collision sprite. And that's all we need to do, really. We don't have to add any events to this because we're going to get the player to work it out for us. Now, bear in mind, I'm going to call this obj_collision, just so we know that that's where it is. So go back onto the room. We can now start adding collision to this collision layer. Now, make sure that you make it the exact same grid as what the other ones are. So 18 by 18. So it doesn't matter for your player, it just matters that it matches up with the tiles that are on there, which it should do. So if you look, the grids now match with these tiles. So I can add collision on. So what I'm going to do is drag one collision on. Oops, I need to snap it because I've turned snap off. I did say that snap does work when you turn it off, and it does. So there you go. So snap it here, and then I'm going to grab it and then just make it longer. And now if you look, you can see that there's collision being added to it. Now we need to add these to each platform that we currently have. Now what I might do, just to show that we have it, is I'm going to add some collision as well. Oops. Let's grab this. I'm going to add some collision here, and I'll put a platform there in a second. I might also put another platform. In fact, I put collision on the floor as well, just so it stops us from falling off. Let's do it that way. So there you go. So collision for the floor. And we'll also put collision on this one as well, just for now. Just to show that it does rely on these for collision. Right, so now we've set its collision up, so we know where it's going to collide. I'm also just going to quickly add for the tile set. So let me add one here just so we can see it. So the reason I made the collision see-through is just so obviously you can see the things behind it and you know what's making collision. I might also add some things on the floor actually, because that would be much easier. I'm going to use this middle one just so you can see that there is collision. There we go. Right, so if we play this, he's still going to go through it at the minute because we've not actually said, oh, you need to stop when it collides with this. So that's what we're going to add now. So if you go back onto your OBJ player, we can now add some collision to him. So if we go on step, because that's where it'll need to be on. So every frame we need to be checking for collision because otherwise it won't work properly. So what I would suggest is you check for collision before you check your speed, because otherwise that will mean that if your speed's fast enough, it will go through your collision before it even checks it. So we need to check collision first. Now it doesn't matter that your gravity is speeding up here, that isn't an issue. So we'll do collision first and we can leave that where it is. So what we need to do, if statements are just checking if something hits something else. You probably should have done that already. So there's something called place meeting that we're going to use for this. Now it's not the best option, but you'll see why it's not the best option, because collision can get stuck, but for now it will work. So if place meeting x, so x is wherever it is on the x axis, so it doesn't matter where it is on screen, it will check it, and then y plus y speed. So what that does is it checks if the speed goes. So on the next frame, if your Y value goes into the collision, it will stop and put you back up above the collision. And that's what games usually do anyway. They check just after themselves as you're running, so it knows to stop the frame before so it doesn't go through. Otherwise, you'll be able to clip into things, and that's how some games do work. It does let you clip into it if it's not set up properly. So we check for if you're underneath it or on top of it as well, so it'll check above as well, which is quite handy. And we want to check with the object we created, which is obj_collision. So we check with collision, see if your player is actually going through it or not. Now, if it is at any point going through it or touching it, we make y speed equal to 0. So that basically means that you cannot go off screen. It will just stop at the collision and stay on top of the collision. So now we have gravity. And we also have collision detection, so it can actually jump on them things that we gave collision. So if we press play, we should be able to just fall now if we move left to right, we'll be able to fall, which we can. And we obviously won't go on screen. Now, obviously, I can go through this collision at the minute, and I've kept the collision on purposely so I can see it. But we can't, we aren't stopped on the x-axis at all, look. So we also need to set that up, because we haven't set that up yet. But we can go left and right with gravity, and it's absolutely fine. So now we have collision on the floor. So now we need collision left to right. And again, we need to check before we actually set the y speed, so or the x speed. Now, because of the way we set it up with left and right here, it's going to cause some issues. So I'm going to show you what we need to do to fix that problem. But if we do, if place meeting again, place meeting. So this would be x plus x speed. So this is checking if it's going left to right this time, and then y, because we don't need to worry about y, because that's already been checked. obj underscore collision. Now what this will do is check if we're going into something left to right, which if we are, it will also stop. So we need to do x speed equals nothing, like that. Now this might not work correctly, but for obvious reasons. So let's have a look. Let's see what happens. So now we've got his character again. Move left to right, and hopefully... Right, so you see, it's still going through. Even though we're telling it to stop. It's not working as intended, as we want it to. So, the reason for this is because this is being run separate to, say, this. So what we need to do is put these into the main step event, which is quite easily done. So... what I would suggest we do, so you can use left and right for some games, depends on what type of game you're using, that's absolutely fine. Say if you're using like Asteroids and you wanting to turn the ship in Asteroids, that would be absolutely fine, you can use these, but for this in particular, not so great. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete these, because we don't necessarily need them anyway on this. We should probably do it all in the step event. My advice would be, try and do as much in the step event as possible, so you're checking every frame if something's happening. If you're holding down a key, if you're letting go of the key, it'll just check every frame. That's what the step event is. So, we need to make sure we're going the right way. And we also need to make sure if we're pressing the keys that we want to press. So, what we need to do is at the beginning, actually, so right at the beginning of this. So, var, so we are going to make a variable for this, left, because we're going to create this as a keyboard key. So keyboard underscore check vk underscore left. So if we hit left, it will go left, or it will check the left anyway. And we're also going to make far right as well. So keyboard underscore check vk underscore right. So these will check if we're hitting left and right. Now, the way these work, so it works as a true or false. So basically what it'll say is, if this is not being hit at any point, false. So currently, because I'm not hitting any keys, it'll say both left and right are both false. So they're both either 1 or 0. So if you've done binary before, 1 being true, 0 being false, that's basically what these do. Now what we need to do is set a direction based upon which keys we're pressing. Now there's something we can create for that, so I'm going to create something called var direction. Or in fact, we'll call it var x direction, because there is already something called direction. So x direction like that equals right minus left. So what this will do, if I hit the left key, so if I hit the left key, this will be 1, this will be 0. So what this will end up being is 1 minus 0, which should equal 1, which means that oh sorry, that would be minus 1, sorry, because it's 0 and 1. That's my apologies, that's me being stupid. So there you go. So it should be minus 1, which is correct, because we saw that on the left key press, so it'll make it negative going that way. And alternatively, if we have it the other way around, so if right's 1 and that's not, so that's 0, so that's 0 and that's being pressed, then that is going to be 1, which means that it's going to go that way. So that's just checking which direction we're moving, and we can apply that to something. So let's do this now. In fact, let me just delete these other comments because we don't need it at the moment. Right. So what we now need to do is do right. X speed. Oops. Lowercase x. Speed equals x direction. So which direction it's traveling. Times speed. Or SPD as we called it actually. Because speed's the inbuilt one. So this will actually set the speed either or now. And then we can add the same code at the bottom that we had before. So x plus equals x speed. So now it will go in the right direction. And it will set a speed for us. And it will check the collision and set the x speed to nothing if there's something wrong. So this should now be fixed. And hopefully if we press play, we'll see if it works. So now, if we jump off here and go left into this block, yeah, it has indeed stopped us. So now we can't go into the blocks either, but we can still go off screen because there's no collision there. We haven't put any collision on it. So that's basically how to add some collision onto this object now. And the last thing we just need to do really quickly is set it to jump. So what I'm going to do is comment this. So see if left or right keys are pressed. Set direction. Set speed and direction. Set gravity speed. Check for collision on Y and X axis. Move player if checks are okay. There we go. So now all we need to do is check to see if something's on the ground, and then we can start jumping hopefully. So this is also really easy to add on. So let's do var jump this time, and we're going to have that as a keyboard check again. So keyboard underscore check VK space up VK underscore space. Can do that properly. I pressed insert by mistake. I wonder why I was doing that. So VK underscore space, and we're going to check to see if the character's jumped essentially. So quite easy. So we're going to have another variable. I'm going to call it on ground. So we're going to check, see if the character's on ground. Because if he's on ground, that means he can jump. If he's not on the ground, that means he shouldn't be able to jump because he can't jump in midair unless you set that up. But if you didn't check for that, he could just infinitely jump and disappear off the screen. So we're going to also check for that. So we need to have another collision check for that. So place meeting X. So it doesn't matter where we are on screen on the X value. What it does matter is if we're on top of something. So we'll just do Y plus 1 this time. So we don't need speed. We just need to check if we're on top of something. And then the collision. We need to check it's on the collision for it to work. So that's going to be used. So check if character is on the ground. So check if the character's on the ground, then if he is, we can jump. That's going to be the main thing. So I'm going to check before the collisions, because we can just see if we're going to jump first, because we don't need to check left and right collisions for that, or if we're going down, because if we're already jumping, then we won't need to check. So we need to check if on ground. Double and means we can check two things at once. So if we're on the ground and we press jump, so if we're on the ground and the player presses jump at any point, we want to send them in the air. And literally just set the Y speed to equal the jump height, which the jump height we set up earlier in the create function here. So we set a jump height of 11. Now, jump height will... So the way this works is the Y speed is going down. So if we want it to go up, we need to have it minus Y speed. So basically minus the jump height. So it will send you in the negative direction, so upwards. So now, if we were to check this, we should be able to jump with space quite happily. So let's go on here and check. So I can move left to right as normal, still collision. If I press spacebar, there you go, jumps. We've got some fairly alright gravity, to be honest. It's not looking too bad, that. And obviously we can jump through these because there is no collision, which we said there wasn't, so it'll go right through. But there you go. We've got a nice jumping character now that can go through your level and jump. Perfect. So the other thing, just to quickly note, just before this video ends, you can also, so you can keep the collision on there, but if you click this little eye, you can hide the collision. So when we press play again, and we put this on screen, you'll see that it's still hitting these things, but the collision's not visible now, and that's what obviously would happen when you're running your game for real. Now, there are some issues with using place meeting, which do things like that. So because of place meeting, it thinks, well, the character is currently colliding with this thing and it's inside it, so it thinks that it shouldn't move. So if you hit it sideways in a particular way, usually by the corner, it will just stop and say, nope, can't do that. Like, I'm just going to keep you in midair the entire time. But other than that, it pretty much works. So that's how you make a thing with, or an object with, that can move around a map, has collision, basically like a little platformer, so basic jumping, that sort of thing. There are other things I might show you, so, editing this so we can do something else with it, but that's how you basically make a simple player object with some physics and some keys in order to do something with.